Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Gino and Jasmine. Someone emailed in using the contact form on our website. Anonymous listener from Seattle says, I just want to share some thoughts on your most recent video on Gino and Jasmine from an autistic perspective. There do seem to be some signals that Gino is potentially on the autistic spectrum. Regarding Jasmine's controlling behavior, by the time someone who is semi-invisibly autistic and at Gino's age, they have gotten probably thousands of messages from other people that they need to do things that don't make any sense to them. Imagine this happening in big and small ways throughout your lifetime, and also having a hyper-specific, precise brain through which you are trying to make sense of other people and their behavior, and then you learn, and what you learn is that basically everyone has parts of them that are pretty unreasonable, and it is totally normal to have unreasonable demands placed on you and to be required to adjust to all kinds of things that feel irrational and unreasonable and kind of bad to you. This is for sure what happened to me and how I ended up in an abusive relationship without knowing that I was being abused. Interesting. So what anonymous listener from Seattle is saying is that for some people with autism, they learn that other people, it's hard to figure them out, and sometimes you have to deal with behavior that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, which makes it more likely that you won't be able to detect abuse that's happening to you when it actually starts happening, because you have a general feeling like, well, this must be my fault, because it usually is my fault. And that's an interesting point. We don't know if that's what Gino is going through, but it's possible. Caleb and Alina video. Two Cute Puppies says, first thing I thought of when you started discussing Alina's disappointment reminded me of something I read about wedding nights and the number of couples who are just plain too tired or drunk to consummate their marriage on the wedding night. Nothing to be ashamed about, it's just reality. Huge expectations meets the limits of human endurance. Yeah, I remember reading statistics saying something like half of people don't have sex on their wedding night for various different reasons. And, maybe being drunk or too tired or something like that. I Smell Sex and Candy says, there was a viral video of a man who has CP and uses a wheelchair wanting to go backpacking in the mountains. He and his friends went backpacking and took turns carrying their friend in a pack similar to the one Caleb bought for Alina. Interesting. Sammy says, I just became a patron today. I'm excited for all the deep dives and to support your work, Dr. Honda. Thank you so much for becoming a patron, Sammy. Music to my ears. If there's one thing that y'all can do to support what we're doing here, if you like what we're doing, and it's just one thing, it's becoming a patron. When people become a patron, it literally gives me the ability to do this sort of stuff. And there's every month a pretty sizable percentage of people who are canceling. And so we need a continual, just to stay afloat, we need people signing up every month. Totally up to you, of course, and thank you for Sammy for doing it. Stephanie, the Kegel episode. Vanessa says, the therapist seemed to be entirely focused on the physicality when Stephanie's hesitation appears to be emotionally driven. Not that the two are disconnected in sex, but I can definitely see why you are picking up on some possible bad advice. I don't think you can Kegel your way through trauma. Yeah. I don't think you can Kegel your way through trauma. Yeah, it seemed like the advice did not, I think, meet Stephanie's needs. Now, maybe Stephanie seemed to take to it pretty well, but given what Stephanie was presenting, if I was treating her, I would go down a lot of exploratory roads around emotions and trauma and expectations and hopes and baby steps and what she would like to get and who she is sexually and her ideas about other people, what she feels entitled to, meaning that I get the impression that she kind of struggles with, is it okay if I assert myself, and letting her have that entitlement, So anyway, Euthanistic says, I think Stephanie is framing it as losing her celibacy with the intent to communicate the anxiety she might be feeling about being out of practice. Right. So she keeps saying losing her celibacy, and I keep thinking that's kind of an odd way of describing it. If I were in her shoes, I would say having sex after not having sex for a couple years. I wouldn't call it celibacy, just sounds so, I don't know, bigger than what it is. When I think of celibacy, I think of like a priest who is celibate for their whole life. I don't think of someone who, a lot of people don't have sex for a couple of years. I wouldn't call that celibacy. I'd just call that you just didn't have sex for a couple of years. But if she intends to communicate to others that this is kind of a big deal to me emotionally, and I'd like a bigger word for that, yeah, it makes sense. Bumbini left a nice comment that I won't read because it's embarrassing to read out loud, but thank you so much, Bumbini. SB says, the general feeling I get from this channel is being a wasp that hits the window at the same spot several times, attempting to fly out, and then being gently guided to the opening and then suddenly flying off. I might not be more wiser yet, but it got me somewhere I wanted to be in that moment. That is a great metaphor. I mean, it's flattering, but I love that visual of a wasp just like banging into the window, the same spot, and you're just like, hey, you do this sometimes, right? The window's open, or you open the window a little bright, and you're like, hey, get out the window, and then you push the wasp out the window, and the wasp flies up. And it's like, well, the wasp didn't really learn anything, but, wasp is better off than it was before because someone came along and said, hey, go this way. Yeah, that's great. Colt video. Jules, good old Jules, says, having a mismatch of sexual energy. Yeah, so in this video, there was talk between Colt and Vanessa about different libidos. Having a mismatch of sexual energy or desire can be really tough in a relationship. My ex was someone who, like Colt, who wanted sex all the time, and he had blamed me for not meeting his needs. He would go to strip clubs and shady massage parlors to get sex and then later blame me for his sin because he felt that I was just not willing to fulfill his desires. I can relate to Vanessa for the feeling she has of feeling pressured to please Colt so that he doesn't cheat or leave her. For a long time, I was so anxious and felt so much shame for not being able to fulfill my ex's sexual needs. It definitely made me feel like I was broken. Thankfully, I'm out of that situation now and am in a much healthier relationship. Right. There's a big difference between having sexual libido differences and there being abuse or control or harm done either direction. So that's important. So with Vanessa and Colt, it's hard to know what's happening there. We could imagine Colt being a jerk face, but we don't know. Vanessa didn't point to that. And their conversations on stage or, on the show don't seem to exhibit that, but we don't know. So Vanessa could be in a situation similar to you, Jules, where Colt is saying, I'm going to, go outside of this marriage because you're not meeting my sexual needs. There's something wrong with you, and I've treated couples like this where the high libido person will put the other person down. There's something wrong with you. You're not trying hard enough. You're a terrible person, that kind of stuff. And so there's those situations. But there's another possibility that the Colt and Vanessa situation is just that, there's some disagreements. And Colt's like, hey, do you want to have sex? And then she's like, no, I'm not in the mood. And he's like disappointed, but he's not abusing her. We just don't know. But yeah. And it just points to another aspect of how many people are suffering behind closed doors in their houses and apartments and homes without going to a couples therapist. Couples therapists can help with this. Jules, I don't know if your ex would have been up for it, but if you had gone to a couples therapist, they would have, at least in my style, which is common to a lot of couples therapists, is just say, hey, let's explore that. You have high libido, you have low libido. How are you going to communicate about that? There's nothing wrong with either one of you, but you don't have to hate each other, or one person shouldn't be abusing the other person because of it. And it's actually kind of a complicated topic because sometimes that's not an indication of high libido. It's an indication of other kinds of things, anyway, I'll go down that road. Lavender says, I think you're right about Vanessa not really having a voice and needing the, yeah. So I think in that reaction video, I was talking about how Vanessa seemed to have this indication, some red flags that when she's on the show, she's suddenly given a microphone and given the opportunity to speak for herself. Whereas in her normal life, she doesn't feel confident or supported enough to be able to voice her opinions. And then she's suddenly given the mic and all of this like stuff comes out of her. And so Lavender's saying, I think you're right about Vanessa not really having a voice and needing to have a voice. I think she has shown a clear lack of voice in other instances. For example, when she was married to her previous husband, she said she wanted to break up, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. So she acknowledged that she cheated on her ex-husband with Colt because in that way, she would force her ex-husband to break up with her, since in her opinion, that was the very worst thing she could do to him. So rather than voicing her needs or concerns by breaking up with her ex, it seemed that she goes to the extremes, to cheat to force a breakup, or to ridicule Colt to force him to stop doing some of the sexual stuff she finds annoying. Right. And this is something that I have seen in people with true assertiveness is the ability to assert your needs while taking care of other people within reason. So you state your opinion, or you state your needs, or you make a request, but you have empathy at the same time. You're balancing those two things. And what I find is that that's the third stage of 3 stages. The first stage is you don't say anything, you're a doormat, but you are secretly angry. The second stage is the terrible 2s, is you're just saying no to everything, and you're just like, you're very aggressive and unfair about your requests. And then stage 3 is so stage 2 is good. You're asserting yourself. I mean, you're having a voice. That's good. But stage 3 is having a voice while having empathy and being reasonable about your voice. Anne says, when you say you can disagree and that's okay, it makes me, so I was talking about how Vanessa was like, hey, you can disagree. Vanessa, if you don't like him talking during sex, if you want to have sex, less often, totally fine. Absolutely. You should be able to say, hey, I don't want to do that. Let's not do it. It's not okay to ridicule someone and to shame someone. When you say you can disagree and that's okay, it makes me realize that wasn't modeled for me growing up. It always seemed to me like partners were supposed to agree. I'm trying to come to terms with the reality that individuals aren't always going to agree, and that healthy disagreement and what healthy disagreement looks like. Maybe that's because I grew up in a very religious, traditional gender roles environment where it was just understood that it is the wife's duty to agree with the man. I keep finding pockets of toxic masculinity in my own thinking, even when I think I've gotten rid of all of it. Yeah, pockets of toxic masculinity or pockets of sexism. I have a similar experience, and that I've been working on my internalized sexism for 30 years, and since I became aware of it as a teenager, and yet a lot of it still exists in my head. It's really hard to purge all of that. But for you, it sounds like you got a really healthy dose of that, unhealthy dose of that growing up, particularly that women were supposed to agree with the man, and it's possible that Vanessa comes from a similar background. And that creates a lot of internal strife, and then it suppresses your voice. And then when you do have a voice, you have that second stage where it's good that you have a voice, but you're not being empathetic and not being differentiated. If Vanessa on stage had been like, so my wonderful husband loves to have sex a lot, and I want to have sex less often, but it's great that he wants to have sex, but I don't want to have sex. He also loves to talk a lot during sex, which I'm not going to yuck his yum, but he likes to talk a lot. I don't like to talk a lot. I don't like to hear talking. So we kind of have that difference. And so we're kind of working that, and hey, Colt, maybe tone it down a little bit. Not a big deal that you want that, but it kind of distracts me. That's a differentiated, assertive way of talking about things, I think, in my opinion. Another Colt video, Anna, good old Anna, says, thank you for always taking a non-judgmental stance on these people. Even when we want to judge just because we don't like them, it's probably something I should practice too. Thanks for making the world a kinder place. Well, that is one of my major goals in life as a human being on this planet, is to try to make the world a kinder, better place, but also specifically through non-judgment. Judgment is, I'm realizing, watching reality TV, is such a common human reaction that is really destructive for all involved. Lucas says, this kind of makes me feel better. I'm currently living at home, and sometimes my mom will make me a plate when dinner is ready. Right, so I was talking about the way the show comes across and the way a lot of people react to the show. They shame Colt for living with mom, and I think I was saying something like, it's fine, you know. There are things that we want to watch out for, but anyway, so Lucas says, this actually kind of makes me feel better. I'm currently living at home, and sometimes my mom will make me a plate when dinner is ready. So this video helped me reflect on it, as I was beginning to feel a sense of shame around it, on top of the social stigma of living at home in my late 20s. So thank you, Dr. Honda, for breaking down stupid cultural stigmas we get hung up on and internalize that, like you said, don't really have any rationale behind them. It's weird to feel shame around a parent being nice or courteous. There are much bigger issues in the world to worry about than my mom putting food on my plate. Let's all give props to the moms out there, and remember to give your mom a call before she calls you, LOL. Yeah, when you think about things that we should be shaming or stigmatizing, like crimes and harm and exploitation and lots of things that we could point to, and yet we also shame people that in their late 20s live with their parents, and their parents sometimes make food for their adult son. That you're just like, why would we be shaming that? Mina says, regarding adults living with parents, I'd say that it's a stigma in more developed countries. Where I'm from, it's really common for adults to live with their parents. I grew up with my parents and my grandma and my aunt in one apartment. Yeah, it sort of makes me wonder what the stigma exactly is in Western or American society. And I think it has to do with class, that in order to be middle, or upper class, one of the indications is that you have enough money to afford your own home. And if you're living in a smaller space with your parents and your grandma and stuff, it's seen as lower class or even maybe immigrant class. And that's why we stigmatize it, in the same way that if someone has off-brand shoes, you're like, ew, So, Big Ed video. Michelle says, I feel so torn about Ed. Part of me feels bad that he can't socialize properly, but another part of me gets really annoyed at his self-centered behavior. Most of my feelings consist of wanting to shake him and yell, stop trying so hard. Yeah, Michelle, that's interesting. I think I've had a similar feel, but you put it into words of just like, Ed, stop trying so hard. Just relax. Just be like when he's dating, what's her name? Coyote. She seems relaxed and just, fluidly moving through the world and dating him and saying, well, we'll see how things go. And Ed just seems to be like really micro thinking everything. What if I do this? I got to do that. And his facial expressions almost seem like a put on at times because he's trying to get her to like him, or he's trying to project a certain image of himself or something. And it's just like, stop it. And I don't know if Big Ed suffers from anything or any personality disorder, but I will say that people who are lower on the spectrum of narcissistic personality disorder can sometimes be of a type where they're seen that way, where people are just like, hey, relax. A common phrase for people moderate to mild narcissistic personality disorder, a common phrase that that they will hear from other people is, you're really intense. Like, you're a lot. It's very laborious to hang out with you. I like you, but you're a lot. There's a lot of energy that I have to put into our conversations and our relationship. You never just relax and chill. Because when you're narcissistic, it's a reaction, it's a defensive reaction to being made to feel completely worthless when you're growing up. And so you're in this constant treadmill of narcissistic supply, and part of that involves having relationships that are constantly indicative of it's going well. It's also kind of attachment insecurity thing, but we don't know if that's what Big Ed is going through, but it's possible. Courtney says, the comment that Ed said when he said she would see through it makes me nervous because it implies he knows he's being deceptive. Yeah, absolutely. Memphis and Hamza. Marie says, I honestly feel like the language barrier helped in this instance. She broke her feelings down to the simplest parts, and he did too. That's interesting, Marie. I hadn't thought about that, but that does make sense. And I've experienced that as a therapist when I've worked with translators. Sometimes it really makes you think about your words, and you have to be very precise because you can't just have a fluid back and forth conversation. And so sometimes what that increases the ability is more self-reflection and more precision in your language. Whereas with someone that speaks your language well enough, you might have a conversation where you're just like, hey, I just really, you let me, or I don't know, what would be a common phrase people would say. Like with Memphis, she might say to someone about the cell phone thing, she might say something like, oh, you just don't love me. That's what's happening right here. Like, what's going on? Are you trying to scam me? That kind of language. But because she has to be careful in her language when they're translating, she has to think, okay, what's happening with me? Like, because I think a part of it is you're saying something, or sometimes texting actually works this way. Not for all couples, but for some couples, they actually can communicate better over texting, because as you're typing something out or you're saying something to a translator, you're thinking like, okay, what am I saying? It's like it's easiest to describe over texting. You're typing it out. You have a few sentences, and usually people, hopefully, you kind of read through it before you send it. And you're like, well, that's probably not very fair. And so it gives you a chance to kind of look at it. Camilla says, I really feel sorry for Hamza's mother. Yeah, me too. She let Hamza bring his girlfriend over, and they disrespected her rules. He definitely should have sprung for a hotel room like Memphis was willing to do, or left in the middle of the night so his mother didn't have to see him there and endure that surprise. Yeah, and there were some other comments saying that for this family, they might live in an extremely conservative part of Tunisia, and as evidenced by the fact that the mom was ostracized from workplaces because of her status as a divorced individual, which is just ridiculous. I mean, in my society anyway, that's just, it's not like we don't stigmatize divorced people in my society, but anyway. And it's possible that if this gets out, which of course it will because it's on TV, right, that this would be further shame to the family and further shame to her and his sister. And why would you do that? I don't know if that's the case, but it just makes you wonder. And you think about other storylines we've seen, like with Jenny and Summit, where these kinds of shames on a family can really cause problems. So yeah, the whole thing, it's like, why, one, did you do that? Two, why did you let the cameras pick it up? Three, why didn't you just leave the room? Four, why didn't you get a hotel? Like, there's so many things, like, why would you do it that way? It just seems so hurtful to the family, right? Now, from an American perspective, it's just like, well, anyway, I think maybe some American families wouldn't do it that way as well. Sharon says, my phone lock screen is of me and my cat, so I feel attacked. Yeah. So was that, Sharon, because your cat was jealous and was like, hey, how come my face isn't, are you hanging out with other cats? Tim and Jennifer from way back when. Willie says, Tim seems to have a pretty complicated personality, but he's still one of the most likable Americans on the show. I can understand some of Jennifer's frustrations in this episode, but she's met his complicated nature with toxicity. Interesting. Irai says, Eeyore is right. I named the episode Eeyore. Eeyore is right, meaning that for Tim, I don't know if I've talked about this yet in the videos I've published, but he seems to exhibit possible depression. I, of course, can't diagnose from afar, but there are some signs, at the very least, some subdued energy and demoralization that he seems to fall into, and this kind of cocooning that he will exhibit that, of course, triggers Jennifer, and then she exhibits unfair behavior. And so I named the episode Eeyore. Eeyore is right. I'm not the most adventurous, sensation-seeking, expressive person, but Tim acts like someone turned his dimmer switch way down. I truly believe he's depressed. I also believe he realized pretty quickly that he and Jennifer were not a good match. Yeah. Linda, well, I also think, according to what Tim was saying, was he felt intimidated. He felt scared of her. So I think that might have also been a factor. Linda says, great analysis. I have to admit, this is painful to watch. Jennifer's behavior is critical, judgmental, and cruel. Yeah. T says, I actually think Tim is a mature communicator. It sounds like he is saying everything in his heart, but it's not what Jennifer wants to hear. For him to say within the first 2 or 3 minutes, I love you, but I'm afraid of you, is so powerful. True. I hadn't thought about it that way. Think about if other people communicated like Tim did, how this show would be so different. Danielle and Muhammad video from way back when, the restraining order episode. Anna, good old Anna, says, nobody deserves to be treated like this. I had this happen with an ex, and it was so scary. I repeatedly told him no, and that we were done. He harassed me via texts and calls multiple times a day for months. One day he just showed up at my house. It was terrifying, and I am still recovering. Yeah, absolutely. The behavior that Danielle is exhibiting, we don't know, but it has the hallmarks of stalking, where you invade their space, you are intimidating, you make threats, you harass, you demand texts, calls, you hold things. You know, if Muhammad needs her to be to like him, because if she doesn't like him, she could create problems for him in terms of his visa and his status in the United States. And so she is either knowingly or unknowingly using that as a weapon against him. So it keeps him, because if he had his way, I'm guessing he would just completely cut off, block the phone number, maybe even get a restraining order, that kind of thing. And so, which he did anyway. But yeah, I mean, Anna, if you've been treated this way, watching this could be very triggering. I mean, stalking is no joke. And I think unless you've experienced it, it might be hard to imagine how abusive it is. Essentially, to break it down, imagine if every minute of your life you are worried and concerned, and there's a certain amount of your brain power and your emotional power being utilized by this notion that at any moment this person could get you. And if they are capable of doing X, Y, and Z, what else are they capable of doing? Would we be surprised if Danielle broke into the house and assaulted him? I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think she's going to do that, but even if that's just a 3% possibility, imagine if every night it's like, well, there's a 3% possibility that this person who is harassing me on phone and showing up at my house, there's a 3% possibility that they're just going to break into my house and kill me, especially if you're a woman, because men are much more prone to this kind of violence. And so imagine if every minute of every day you're just like 3 to 5% concerned, like this could happen at any moment. That is going to take a toll. I mean, that is a constant fear, constant anxiety, constant worry. And you go to the police and they're like, well, has he done anything yet? And you're like, well, no, he's just texting me a lot. He's my ex-partner. And there's no crime that's committed, So, and I consider that to be incredibly wrong. There have to be much more robust laws. And I'm not an expert on the law, but I know that they need to be more robust in this area. And we have restraining orders. We have no contact orders. But they don't have as much teeth as you would like to have in these situations, and so it's a horrible, horrible thing. The people that I've treated who have been stalked would tell me they would much rather have the person just beat them up one day and have it be over than have this constant anxiety and worry and harassment and reminder. The text, you get a text, and for some people that have been stalked, it's like every time you get a text notification, it's like, even if it's just your friend, you're just like, is that person? Your phone rings or your doorbell rings. It's just like, there's just this constant anxiety of like, is this the moment when he's going to get me? Is this the moment when she's going to do this and that? Stalking is no joke. And in the show, they're definitely showing a potential presentation of that. Harris says, I'm all for fighting for love, but at what point does fighting for love turn into stalking? Because in my opinion, Danielle is coming off as extremely stalkerish. Agreed. Anne says, yeah, I definitely should have defined friends in my last break. So I was talking about how Muhammad said, yeah, we can be friends. And then I think both of them had different definitions of that. I think for Danielle, that meant we're going to hang out every day, we're going to talk every day, and we're going to have a total best friend relationship. And for Muhammad, I think he meant like, well, we're just not going to hate each other, and we'll maybe on holidays we'll text each other. So Anna's saying, yeah, I definitely should have. And what I was saying was, people, when you're breaking up with someone and you say, hey, let's be friends, that could be very enticing to the person you're breaking up with, because they're like, oh, I got to retain this relationship. When it's possible you don't want that relationship. You just want things to be nice, or you're just being, it's a consolation prize. You're like, well, I'm not going to be your partner, but I'll be your friend, I guess. And what you need to do is you need to be very clear. When I want to be friends, but here's what I mean by friends. You know, this is the type of friendship. Maybe you are looking for a good friend. You know, maybe you are breaking up and saying, yeah, I do want to hang out all the time, you know, but you have to be clear around that. But so many people are just like, yeah, I want to be friends after we break up. And there's such a wide, you know, variety of what that means, right? Yeah, I definitely should have defined friends in my last breakup. I really meant that I wanted to continue hanging out with our mutual friends, and that we should be civil to each other to keep from making things uncomfortable for them. I think a lot of times people say that they can be friends as a way to lessen the blow and diminish any potential bad reaction to the breakup. Absolutely, yeah. People, you know, the Muhammads of the world will say, let's be friends, because they feel ashamed or guilty, instead of just saying, look, I want to break up with you, and frankly, I don't ever want to see you again, and I'm sorry. It's better to be upfront than to, you know, give people the wrong impression under most circumstances. Vasilia says, yes, he did promise to be her friend, and he did it very intentionally. As soon as she changed the annulment to a divorce, he ghosted her. If he had no interest in staying in touch, he shouldn't have reached out to her right before the court case. It was quite obviously a manipulation tactic, and the kind that tends to be used against women to call them crazy. Obviously, Danielle shouldn't stalk him, but he doesn't get to pretend he didn't have a hand in her feelings. It's hard to know what's going on with Muhammad. There are times when I think that he 100% hates her. I mean, I don't think a lot of people would blame him for that, and does not want to be friends with her, does not want to hang out, wants no contact. But then there are other times, and I don't know if I've published these videos yet, but there are other times that seem to indicate that he does have a warm spot in his heart for her, for what they had, and he might see that she's a tender, good person behind all the behavior. I don't know. It's hard to know. I mean, maybe we'll never know. All right, well, that does it for that episode in which I react to your comments. Thank you all for commenting. I think it's I learn a lot by reading your comments. And I don't know if I've ever said this before, but your comments actually, whenever I'm doing the podcast or the YouTube videos, I'm in a room, I'm in my office, I'm all by myself, no one's around, and I'm just yammering into a microphone or a camera, and it feels weird. It feels isolating, and I'm always like, what are people thinking of? I like conversations. I like to say things and people say things back. And so your comments are doing that for me. It's like, okay, I watched a show, I said things, now you're reacting. Now, it feels like a conversation, like relationships, which is good for me emotionally. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.